Council, we're just going to wait a little bit. There we go. We're just going to wait a little bit longer to get started here. As soon as we get the green light from the U.S. Marshals, we'll go ahead and proceed. Okay, it looks like we have the green light from the U.S. Marshal Service. So my name is Judge Christian Acevedo. Scoring judges, if you'll do me a favor and please look at the two buttons on the lower left of your screen and make sure your audio and video is turned off. I think that's already the case. That audio and video should remain off until the trial ends. You should also have your video set to hide all non-video participants. So go ahead and adjust your settings if necessary. And that should mean that the only people on the screen right now should be the advocates and myself. Okay, calling the case, case number 10N1-2020, United States versus Kara Bassett. Counsel, will you please make your appearances?
Yes, Your Honor. Good evening. My name is Taylor Rich, and I'm proud to be representing the government in this case. I'm joined today by my second chair and my co-counsel, Ms. Abby Branham.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Good afternoon, and your second chair, I guess, won't be speaking, but I heard quite a bit of an echo there, so just something to be cognizant of for the second chair with the audio settings. But good afternoon and good evening.
May the defense make appearances, Your Honor?
Of course.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. My name is Stephen Becker. I'm joined today by my colleague, Mr. Bennett Dembski. He'll be handling the technology side of things.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
All right, good afternoon and good evening to both of you. Before we proceed to opening statements, do we have any pretrial matters to address?
Just one thing from the government, Your Honor. At this time, I'd like to direct your attention to exhibits 4 through 33 in this case have been pre-admitted. We just wanted to make Your Honor aware of this stipulation because we intend on using these exhibits in opening statement and throughout today's trial.
Okay, I do see that stipulation. Defense counsel, anything to add?
No, Your Honor, that's our understanding as well, and we will be using the exhibits as well.
Okay.
We'd also like to invoke Rule 615, which provides for the constructive sequestration of all witnesses, barring party representatives.
Government, do you have any party representatives present with you today?
Yes, Your Honor. The government's party representative will be FBI agent Steph Johnson.
Okay. Defense, any issue with the FBI agent being present during trial?
No issue with that, Your Honor. We would designate Ms. Bassett as our party representative. She'll be here for her own trial.
Naturally. Okay. Anything else from the parties before we proceed?
Nothing further from the prosecution, Your Honor. We're ready to proceed with opening.
We're ready as well, Your Honor.
Okay. We will now hear opening statements from both parties. Everybody should make sure that they are in speaker view. That Zoom button is in the upper right of the screen for most folks. Counsel, please remember to mute your audio when the other attorney is speaking, unless, of course, you have an objection or need to get the court's attention for some reason.
Yes, Your Honor.
Government, please proceed with your opening statement.
the defendant was willing to kill for what she wanted. It's the summer of 2017, and the defendant isn't in control. She and her husband own an elephant park in Tallahassee, Florida. But the defendant doesn't feel like that park is really hers. You see, her husband had promised her when they got married that she would be able to run the park the way she wanted to. But 6 years have gone by, and the defendant's husband still hasn't lived up to that promise. The defendant still hasn't gotten what she wanted. Disagreements about how the park should be run turn into arguments, turn into physical altercations between the defendant and her husband. The defendant decided that summer she was tired of not having what she wanted. She decided she had enough of watching as her husband ran a park that was supposed to be hers. On August 18th, 2017, the defendant decided she was willing to kill for what she wanted. Members of the jury, the evidence today will show that the only person standing in the way of what the defendant wanted was her husband, Don Clark. You'll learn today that on August 18th, the defendant picked up a syringe filled with lethal elephant tranquilizer, and she used it to end her husband's life. Members of the jury, that's why we've charged the defendant with murder. The government carries what's called the burden of proof in today's case. I have the burden to prove beyond any reasonable doubt that it was the defendant who murdered her husband. And to meet this burden today, I'll call FBI agent Steph Johnson to the stand, who was the lead investigator in this case. Agent Johnson will walk you through the evidence she collected that shows the defendant was willing to kill for what she wanted. She will tell you that Mr. Clark owned millions of dollars worth of assets, cars, planes, investments, and the park that the defendant wanted so badly to be hers. You'll learn today that if Mr. Clark were to suddenly disappear, every single one of those assets would go straight to the defendant. Agent Johnson is going to tell you that the defendant had a way to make her husband disappear. The defendant had access to syringes filled with lethal tranquilizer. And you'll learn today that when the FBI searched the elephant park, one of those syringes was missing. With her husband gone, the defendant could finally run the park the way she wanted to for years. The evidence will show today that's exactly what happened. Because within just a few months of her husband suddenly going missing, the defendant completely transformed that park. The defendant had gotten exactly what she wanted. At the end of today's trial, you and I will have one more chance to discuss the evidence in this case. At that point, it'll be clear to you that Mr. Clark was murdered because the defendant decided that what she wanted was more important than her husband's life. The evidence will show that on August 18th, 2017, the defendant was willing to kill for what she wanted. That's why I'll ask you to find the defendant guilty. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Rich. Does the defense have an opening statement?
Yes, Your Honor.
Please proceed.
Your Honor, Ms. Rich, members of the jury, may it please the court. Guesses just aren't good enough. I want to introduce you to Kara Besman. On August 18th, 2017, her husband left in the middle of the night and never came back. He left his wife behind. Flew to Costa Rica, dropped off the grid, disappeared without saying goodbye. But the government? Miss Rich, they want you to believe that Miss Bassett was willing to kill for what she wanted. That she murdered her own husband in cold blood. But here's the problem with that, members of the jury. What you're going to realize today is that when Miss Rich tells you what occurred on the evening of August 18th, when she tells you what happened to Mr. Clark, she's guessing. And in a case like this, members of the jury, guesses just aren't good enough. You see, they couldn't find Mr. Clark's body, so they guessed that he was dead. They saw that his van had at some point gone to a swamp, so they guessed that his body was dumped there. And when they guessed that his wife was the killer, when they made her their villain, when they made guess after guess after guess, members of the jury, they ignored crucial evidence. Evidence that indicates that Mr. Clark isn't dead at all. Evidence that indicates that he chose to disappear, chose to run away. Evidence that indicates that he is still very much alive to this day, living in Costa Rica. Guesses just aren't good enough, members of the jury, and that means something. Because when the prosecution came to court today, they came with a burden. It's their job to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. But what does that mean? It means that it's Ms. Rich's job to build a chain of evidence. One that not only fits together, but one that is so strong, so airtight that it can withstand anything and everything the defense throws at it. And the government's not going to be able to do that today, ladies and gentlemen. Because we're going to show you the 3 weak links in that chain of evidence. The 3 guesses that they're asking you to make. The first is a guess about the body. You see, Ms. Rich wants you to believe that Mr. Clark died back in 2017, but folks, it's been 3 years, and there is not a shred of evidence to support the fact that he is dead. The second guess is a guess about the swamp. See, a crucial part of the government's timeline involves Ms. Bassett going to this swamp in the middle of the night. But what you're going to learn today is that the sole piece of evidence that the government is relying upon to make that claim is shaky. It's nebulous. It requires you to guess, and we're going to show you the problems with it today. The third guess they're asking you to make is a guess about why Don Clark disappeared. We're going to call a witness to that stand today, a man by the name of Joe Kwong, a documentary filmmaker who knew both Cara Bassett and her husband very well. Someone who actually went to Costa Rica looking for Mr. Clark after his disappearance, and he's going to tell you that he found evidence that Mr. Clark is still alive. Members of the jury, as you listen to the evidence, I think you're going to realize that the facts that you would expect a prosecution to have in a case this serious, they just don't have them. You'll see that they're trying to replace the missing links in that chain of evidence with guesses. And at the end of today's trial, I'm going to come up here again, and I'm going to remind you that guesses just aren't good enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Becker. Okay, before we proceed to the government's case in chief, I'm going to ask everybody to switch to gallery view. That button for most folks is in the upper right hand of your screen, and that's going to allow you to see the attorneys and the witness at the same time. So I'll give everybody just a second to do that. Okay, is the government ready to call their witness?
Yes, Your Honor. The government calls Agent Steph Johnson to the stand.
Agent Johnson, okay. There we go. Agent Johnson, my understanding is that you have already been sworn in, so Ms. Rich, you can proceed when you're ready.
Good afternoon. Please introduce yourself to the members of the jury.
Good afternoon. My name is Special Agent Steph Johnson.
What do you do for a living?
I work for the FBI.
What experience do you have working with the FBI?
I've been working with the FBI since 2002, so about 18 years now. I've completed all of the training or the FBI training and have done so every year for the past 18 years.
Could you tell the members of the jury what your FBI training entails?
Yes, ma'am. So I've been trained in criminal investigations, interrogations, and evidence collection. Basically, I've been trained to complete thorough investigations.
And how are you involved in this case?
I was the lead investigator into the disappearance of Dawn Clark.
Were you able to make an arrest in this case?
Yes, ma'am. In September of 2018, I arrested the defendant, Kara Bassett, for the death of Dawn Clark.
I want to walk the members of the jury through the investigation you conducted. How did it begin?
So the investigation started a couple of years ago, back in August of 2018. On the 18th of August, I received a call from Kara Bassett that her husband had suddenly gone missing. So I went to their residence, which was actually both a residence and an elephant zoo, to investigate what happened to Dawn Clark.
When you arrived at the residence, what did you do?
Well, I spoke to the defendant to see or figure out anything she might have known about her husband's whereabouts. I also searched the entire property to see if we could find any evidence that could tell us what happened to Dawn Clark.
When you searched the property, did you find anything that was of importance to your investigation?
Yes, ma'am. We actually found a case of elephant tranquilizers in a shed on the zoo. These elephant tranquilizers were used to put down dangerous elephants.
And why was that important to your investigation?
Well, when I spoke to the defendant and the other employees at this zoo, it became clear that these tranquilizers they kept track of them very, very carefully. They actually had an entire log where they listed out who used each and every one of these tranquilizers. When I looked at the log, I saw that there were supposed to be 23 tranquilizers in the shed, but when I actually went through and counted the tranquilizers, there were only 23. That means one tranquilizer was missing.
Is this the logbook of the tranquilizers that you're referring to?
Yes, ma'am. As you can see at the bottom, the last person recorded 24 syringes remaining. When I actually went to the shed and counted all the syringes, there were 23.
Did you conduct any interviews throughout the course of your investigation?
Yes, ma'am. I interviewed everyone I could think of who might know what happened to Dawn Clark. I spoke to his wife. I spoke to all of his employees. I even spoke to people in Costa Rica to see if they had any idea what happened to Dawn Clark.
What were you able to learn from your interviews with the defendant?
Right, so the defendant and I spoke several times over the course of my investigation. And as I was investigating her, it became clear that she might have been involved in her husband's disappearance.
Objection, Your Honor. Improper opinion under 701.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Yes, Ms. Rich, go ahead.
This witness is testifying about her FBI investigation that she conducted into this case. If I have a good faith basis to believe that she's about to lay all the foundation from her interviews with the defendant and why she believed the defendant had the motive, the means, and the opportunity to murder her husband.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Yes, Mr. Becker, how is this an improper opinion?
Well, they haven't laid any of the foundation under 702 to qualify Detective Johnson as an expert. Because of that, she's a lay witness. Her testimony is governed by what she can rationally base on her perception. And certainly making a conclusion like that, it amounts to more than a lay witness opinion. It amounts to an expert conclusion.
Ms. Rich, what was the government's last question before the objection?
I asked Agent Johnson what she was able to learn from her interviews with the defendant. But if I may respond to the objection, this witness is not making an expert opinion. She's testifying to her direct observations as an FBI agent, and she's able to rely on those observations to form an opinion as a layperson.
I think contextually, at this point in the direct, it's appropriate, so I'm going to allow the testimony.
Yes, Your Honor.
Overruled.
Agent Johnson, what were you able to learn from your interviews with the defendant?
So as I was speaking to the defendant and comparing what she was telling us to the evidence that we were recovering throughout the investigation, it became clear to me that the defendant might have been involved in her husband's disappearance. In fact, out of all of these suspects I reviewed who had any connection to his disappearance, she was the only person with the means, motive, and opportunity to murder Mr. Clark.
Your Honor,
I want to.
I would re-raise my objection under 701. May I be heard?
Yes, Mr. Becker, go ahead.
Now, Your Honor, we understand that pursuant to your prior ruling, simply speaking to her knowledge, to her investigation is admissible. We understand that. But what the detective just did there is she went a step further. She said that this was the only person with the means, the motive, and the opportunity to commit this crime. Now, that is certainly far beyond what a lay witness can testify to. And even if she claims that it's just within the context of her investigation, it's certainly suggesting a conclusion to the members of the jury.
Ms. Richter, please.
I still believe that this witness is a lay person who is testifying to her direct observations. She's able to form a conclusion as a lay person, and we're fine with instructing the members of the jury that this witness is not an expert witness, and she's testifying to her direct observations as the lead FBI investigator in this case.
I think the jury will understand that. And Mr. Becker, I think you're going to have ample opportunity, which I think you're going to take advantage of, to cross-examine the witness to those things that you think she might be missing. So I'm going to overrule the objection. I'll allow the testimony.
Yes, Your Honor.
Agent Johnson, I want to break those things down for the members of the jury. Why do you say that the defendant had the motive to murder her husband?
Well, while I was speaking with the defendant, she made it clear to me that she and her husband had been experiencing some disagreements. You see, they were both running this elephant zoo, but they had disagreements about how the zoo should be run. It was my understanding that the defendant wanted it to be a sanctuary, but her husband wanted it to be a business.
Well, how did Mr. Clark run the elephant park when he was still alive?
According to the defendant, he didn't run it very well, or not the way she wanted. He had the elephants in cages. He let customers get really close to them. He let customers ride them. These were all things that were really bothersome to the defendant, or that's what she told me.
Did you find any evidence in your investigation that explained why the park was being run that way?
Well, Don Clark was the person who actually owned the park, so he had control over how the park was run, whereas the defendant, she didn't really have a say. She didn't have ownership. So that seemed to be the reason why the park was run the way Don Clark wanted.
I'm having my second chair pull up Exhibit 4. Agent Johnson, do you recognize this?
Yes, ma'am.
What is
this?
it?
This is a letter from Mr. Clark's attorney, who wanted to she wanted to make statements that she knew regarding Don Clark's disappearance. She wanted to be helpful in the investigation.
Did this letter affect your investigation in any way?
Yes, ma'am. In this letter, Mr. Clark's attorney describes an unusual clause that was added to a power of attorney document that the defendant and her husband signed in June of 2017. So for context, usually with power of attorney documents, it says that, if a person gets disabled, then another person has the ability to take over their assets and their finances. But the weird thing about the power of attorney document for the defendant is that it wasn't just disability that caused her to be able to take over assets. She was able to take her husband's assets as long as he disappeared.
Well, after Mr. Clark disappeared, do you know what happened to the elephant park?
Yes, ma'am. The defendant converted the elephant park into an elephant sanctuary.
Do you recognize this photograph? I'm having my second chair pull up Exhibit 8.
Okay.
Do you recognize
Yes,
that?
yes, ma'am.
What is that
This
a photo of?
This is a photo that was taken of the elephant park before Mr. Clark went missing. As you can see, it has the animals in cages.
Now, Ms. Branham, could you display exhibits 23 and 25? What are these photos of?
So these are photos of the elephant park after Mr. Clark's disappearance. As you can see, the elephants are sort of roaming free. I don't believe there were any more cages at the park.
Did you find that the defendant had the means to murder her husband?
Yes, ma'am. So earlier I talked about how when we searched the property, there was a syringe missing, an elephant tranquilizer syringe. So we found out during the investigation that the defendant actually had access to those elephant tranquilizer syringes. They were kept in a shed with a lock. The defendant had the key.
Did you find that the defendant had access to anything else important to your investigation?
Yes, ma'am. She had access to her husband's van.
And why was the defendant's access to that van important?
Well, we actually found that on the night that on the night that Don Clark disappeared, his van was being moved around the city.
And you said that the defendant, oh, my apologies. I'm having my co-counsel pull up Exhibit 31. What do these GPS records tell you?
So they tell us that at around 11:17, Don Clark's van was at his home. It then left his home and went about 134 miles away to a swamp, Big Gum Swamp. And then I believe on the next page, it'll show the van going to an airport. Right.
After completing your investigation, what was your ultimate conclusion?
Based on my investigation, I concluded that the defendant killed Mr. Clark with a syringe, that she transported his body to the swamp using his van, and then she reported him missing.
I have nothing further for this witness.
Does defense counsel wish to cross-examine?
Yes, Your Honor.
Please proceed.
Good afternoon, Detective Johnson.
Good afternoon, sir. How are you?
Doing pretty well. I want to begin by making one thing very clear for the members of this jury.
Yes, sir.
Detective, you cannot look this jury in the eye and tell them that you know with certainty that Don Clark is dead, can you?
I can tell them that the evidence in this case suggests that he was murdered by his wife and the defendant.
And you can tell us how you interpret the evidence, but man, you haven't seen a body, have you?
We haven't recovered Mr. Clark's body. You're correct.
You've never spoken to anyone who's claimed to have seen a body, have you?
Right. After August 18th, there were no sightings of Don Clark.
You never found any of Mr. Clark's blood or any other body parts, did you?
No, sir. You're correct.
And ma'am, the reason that you believe that you haven't found that body is because you think that it was dumped in a swamp, right?
Yes, sir. Big Gum Swamp.
Right. That's a picture of the swamp, right?
It is.
Ma'am, the fact is you didn't go to that swamp, right?
Yes. I went to the swamp. The entire FBI team went to the swamp. We also brought dogs to search for Mr. Clark.
Go ahead, ma'am.
I'm sorry. That was, yeah. We went to the,
okay, ma'am.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Like you just said, you went to the swamp with the entire FBI team and you brought dogs, right?
Exactly.
You searched that swamp thoroughly, didn't you?
Absolutely.
And then after your thorough search of that swamp, you did not find Don Clark's body, did you?
That's correct.
You didn't find any evidence from that swamp of Ms. Bassett being there, did you?
Can you be more specific?
Sure, you didn't speak to any eyewitnesses who saw Ms. Bassett at the swamp, did you?
Not eyewitnesses. We didn't have eyewitnesses to tie her to the swamp.
Man, the fact is, you don't have a single thing, a single trace of evidence that Mr. Clark is in that swamp today, do you?
I wouldn't agree with that, sir. We
Okay.
actually have, oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
We actually have the GPS records from Mr. Clark's car. It shows us that his car went to that swamp the same night that he disappeared. I would say that's evidence. My apologies, sir.
And then it drove all the way back, right?
Mr. Becker, I ask that you not cut the witness off in the middle of her answer, please.
My apologies, Your Honor. I think we're having a little bit of delay, but go
I
ahead.
understand.
Right. So we have the GPS records that indicate that Mr. Clark's car went to that swamp the exact night that he disappeared. I would say that this is evidence to suggest that his body ended up in that swamp.
Well, ma'am, you didn't find a body. And another thing that you looked for to try to place him there were some phone records, right?
Yes, sir.
You looked at Miss Bassett's phone records for that night, right?
That's correct.
Man, what you found was that those phone records, that GPS, it doesn't place Miss Bassett anywhere near the swamp, does it?
It doesn't place her phone there. You're correct.
That's exactly right, ma'am. The only cell tower that Miss Bassett's phone connected to that night was the one near her house 100 miles away, right?
Exactly.
Detective, I want to talk about what could have happened to Dawn Clark.
Okay.
Detective, you understand that people can choose to disappear, right?
Are they physically capable of leaving places? Is that what you're asking me?
People can choose to fake their own deaths, ma'am.
We do have free will in this country. Yes, sir.
You understand that people can choose to do that when they're in trouble with the law or they're unhappy with their lives, right?
People can do lots of things, sir. They can choose to do whatever they want.
And then you do know that Mr. Clark, he had properties in Costa Rica. Isn't that true?
Yes, sir. He had a vacation home.
You know that he traveled back and forth between the States and Costa Rica pretty frequently.
That's correct?
You know that he owned a private plane, right?
Yes.
And then you also know that Mr. Clark, he had off-the-books cash, right?
He did.
He had off-the-books cash that he was using to buy additional properties in Costa Rica, right?
I think we learned that he was attempting to buy extra properties. I don't believe that he ever actually did. According to his attorney, this document that you have pulled up here, they never actually worked out the details. He went missing before they could.
Well, but you understand that he had off-the-books cash that he was attempting to use to buy additional properties. That's a yes?
That was his intention, but it's not my understanding that he followed through with that. So
And you never found any of that missing off-the-books cash, did you?
I don't believe the cash was missing, but I didn't find off the books cash. You're right.
Ma'am, you actually know that on the night that Mr. Clark disappeared, he had a phone call with someone in Costa Rica, right?
Yes, sir.
Before he answered that phone call, someone from an unlisted Costa Rican phone number texted him, right?
Right. He asked, the unlisted number asked him to call.
And then after he got that text, he called the person and spoke on the phone for 52 minutes, right?
Right.
Detective, who was Don Clark speaking to the night he disappeared?
Well, sir, this number is actually unlisted. That means that the cell phone carriers weren't able to track it to a particular person. So we know that the call came from Costa Rica, but we can't tell you who in Costa Rica called him.
Detective, let's be very clear here. As we sit here in court 3 years later, you have no idea who Don Clark spoke to on the night he disappeared, do you?
We don't know who this number is. He actually spoke to multiple people that night that we can't identify.
You have no idea who the person he spoke to for 52 minutes on the night he disappeared is.
Objection, Your Honor, to asked and answered.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Please.
This is actually a different question. I was clarifying, narrowing down an earlier question so I could get a more clear answer for the members of the jury.
I agree. Proceed, Mr. Becker. Overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
Detective Johnson, you have no idea who the person Don Clark spoke to for 52 minutes on the night he disappeared was, do you?
We cannot identify that unlisted caller. That's true.
Thank you. Your Honor, I have nothing further.
Thank you, Mr. Becker. Any redirect from the government?
No redirect, Your Honor. We have nothing further for this witness.
Okay, thank you. This witness may be excused then. Anything else from the government before we proceed to the defense's case in chief?
Nothing further from the government.
You want me to rest then?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. Mr. Becker, are you ready to proceed with the defense's case in chief?
Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Joe Kwong to the stand.
Okay. Good evening. It's my understanding all witnesses have already been sworn in, so Mr. Becker, you may proceed when you're ready.
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon, sir. Could you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Good afternoon. My name is Joe Kwong.
What do you do for a living, Mr. Kwong?
I'm a documentarian. I go around filming things and I sell them to streaming services. Everything you've been streaming during quarantine, that's all me.
Sir, do you know Kara Bassett and her husband, Don Clark?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Could you describe your relationship with them?
Sure. So back in 2015, Kara Bassett asked me to come and film a documentary of her elephant park called Elephant Queen. If you've seen Tiger King on Netflix, it's like that, but a complete ripoff.
Sir, did you speak with Miss Bassett and her husband a lot? Did you spend a lot of time with them?
Oh, absolutely. So when we were filming Elephant Queen, I was with them basically 24/7 for about 3 years.
So, sir, do you understand what the government is claiming Miss Bassett did today?
Yeah. From what I understand, they're claiming that Kara killed her husband.
I want to talk about that claim and whether it lines up with what you know about their relationship.
Okay.
Sir, how would you describe the relationship between Kara Bassett and her husband?
I mean, it seemed pretty good to me. Every couple has their ups and downs, but it seemed really loving.
At any point in the time you worked with them, did you ever hear Miss Bassett threaten to kill her husband?
Death threats? Oh, no, I don't remember anything like that.
Sir, do you know if the police ever found Mr. Clark's body?
No, from what I understand, they never did.
So they never found his body. I want to talk about where he may be today. Sir, do you know if Mr. Clark owned any properties in Costa Rica?
Yeah. Don had a beach house right on Hermosa Beach. He went there every couple of months.
And how would he get there when he would go?
Oh, he had this little Cessna plane that was right in the hangar about 5 miles from the park.
Objection, Your Honor, to lack of personal knowledge. May I be heard?
Yes, Ms. Rich, go ahead.
This witness just testified that Mr. Clark was able to get to Costa Rica by a specific plane that he owned and was in his name. However, it's the government's belief today that Mr. Clark had many assets that were off the books and many assets that we might not know about. For this witness to testify that every single time Mr. Clark went to Costa Rica, he used that specific plane, that's outside the scope of this witness's knowledge.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Sure.
I don't believe he was making a definitive statement every single time he went to Costa Rica he used a specific plane. I asked him how he generally got there, and he said the plane that he used. Now, this is well within the scope of something that Mr. Kwong would know as someone who basically lived with the two of them, who worked with them every single day for years.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Yes, last chance, Ms. Rich.
This witness just testified about a specific Cessna plane that Mr. Clark allegedly used to get to Costa Rica. Now, this is a point of issue in today's case because this plane of the exact kind was left at the airport on the night in question. It's improper for this witness to testify that that specific plane was used every single time.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Final word, Mr. Becker.
Your Honor, I don't quite understand why this is improper. He's a lay witness, an eyewitness who's testifying to what he observed and what he saw over a number of years. This is a matter of weight, not admissibility, and Ms. Rich can cross on it if she likes.
Okay. I'm going to sustain the objection, but Mr. Becker, I will allow you a fair bit of latitude here to just rephrase the question and so that the witness can attest to what he has seen when he has seen this particular person fly a particular plane. So
yes.
I'll give you a chance to proceed on the same subject line, but please rephrase the question.
Yes, Your Honor.
I'm sorry, Ms. Rich?
Move to strike the offending.
Yes, the previous question and answer is true.
Yes, Your Honor.
Now, Mr. Kwong, speaking just to what you saw, during the times that you know Mr. Clark went to Costa Rica, what plane did you see him take?
I think he had this little personal plane that he would take.
All right, sir, I want to talk about August 18th, 2017, the day that Mr. Clark disappeared.
Let's
Did you
do it.
spend that day with Ms. Bassett and Mr. Clark?
Yep. Yeah, I was with them the whole time filming the documentary.
Sir, did Mr. Clark do or say anything unusual, anything that stood out to you?
Yeah, there actually was this one thing that stood out to me. So around dinner time, I was hanging out with Don, and he looks at his phone and then goes pale white and says, "I've got to go deal with this," and he leaves.
And sir, around what time was that?
Around 6 p.m.
Mr. Dempsey, could we get the call logs, Exhibit 21? Mr. Kwong, I'm showing you Mr. Clark's call logs from that night. Do you see any text messages here that he received around the time that you saw him look at his phone and go pale?
Let's see. Yeah, it looks like he does get a text message from some unlisted number.
And is that text message he receives in English?
Nope, I think that's Spanish.
And sir, after he received that text message that made him go pale, did he call that person back?
Yeah, I think it says in that next one that he called that person back, same unlisted number.
How long did he speak to that unlisted Costa Rican number on the night he disappeared?
Oh, yeah, they're right there.
Mr. Kwong, I'm not quite sure if we got you there. What did you say? How long was it?
Sorry about that. I'm reading it right there. It says 52 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Now, do you know if Mr. Clark texted his wife after he made that call?
Yeah. Kara actually showed me a text that was sent to her by Don.
And what did Mr. Clark text his wife the night he disappeared?
He told her he was going out for a while.
Sir, did you ever see Don Clark again after that night?
I didn't. That was the last I saw of him.
Let's talk about what happened after August 18th. Sir, you said that was the last time you ever saw Mr. Clark. Did you ever go out looking for him?
Yeah, I did. I mean, something didn't add up to me, so I figured I would check out his place in Costa Rica.
So, sir, when you went to Costa Rica, where specifically did you go?
I went to that beach house on Hermosa Beach. I wanted to see if he was there.
When you went to Hermosa Beach, Costa Rica, did you speak with any of the locals?
Yeah, I spoke with some people, showed them Don's picture.
So you say you showed them his picture. Was it this picture, sir?
That's the one.
Sir, when you showed them this picture, what did the locals say?
They said they recognized him.
Did you ever go to his house itself?
Objection, Your Honor. Sorry, my microphone was muted. I tried to get it right when it happened, but I would object speculation to the residents saying that they recognized his picture. May I be heard?
Sure.
For this witness to testify that the people he showed this photo to actually recognized Mr. Clark in the photo, he'd be delving into those residents' mindsets. We have no foundation on who these people are. This witness is just delving into their mindset for what they believe or for how they recognized Mr. Clark.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Yes, please.
Mr. Kwong isn't delving into anyone's mindset. He's telling us what they've told him.
That's what I heard. We don't have the ability for the court reporter to play back the audio at this moment, but I heard him say that the residents told him they recognized him. Is that not your understanding, Ms. Rich?
Well, in that case, Your Honor, I would shift my objection to hearsay. This statement that the residents recognized him is certainly being offered for the truth of the matter asserted, since it is the defense's contention today that Mr. Clark did flee to Costa Rica.
May I respond, Your
Mr.
Honor?
Becker, please.
Richard's exactly right that we're using this statement for the truth of the matter asserted, but it falls under an exception to hearsay, Rule 8031. It's a present sense impression.
How so?
A present sense impression is a statement describing an event or condition. The statement from the declarants, in this case, the locals, is that they recognize the picture they are currently being shown. That's describing their current condition.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Please.
This isn't a present sense impression because we don't have the information, we don't have the foundation laid that this is a present sense impression at all. We simply don't have enough foundation to let this statement in, and for that reason, it's hearsay.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Sure.
Now, we actually did lay the foundation for this. Mr. Kwong just testified that as he was showing those people this picture, they said that that they recognized it. Now, 8031 describes the criteria as being during or immediately after the event perceived. We've laid the foundation that this observation, this description of a condition was during the event perceived, saying, I recognize this picture.
I'm going to overrule the objection. I'm going to allow the testimony.
Yes, Your Honor.
Sir, could you just tell us one more time what those locals said when you showed them that picture?
They told me they recognized him.
Mr. Kwong, did you ever go to Mr. Clark's house in Hermosa Beach, Costa Rica?
Yeah, of course. I wanted to see if he was there.
Sir, the government is claiming that Mr. Clark died back in 2017. When did you go to Costa Rica?
I went in 2018.
So, sir, when you went to Costa Rica a year after the government is claiming he died, did that house look abandoned to you?
I mean, not really. It was spotless. Like, there was no dust that had settled anywhere.
Was the house empty?
Objection to lack of foundation. This witness says,
Please, no,
Okay.
Mr. Rich, how is there a lack of foundation?
this witness just testified that the house was abandoned. However, the only foundation provided for that was that there wasn't dust in the house. This isn't enough foundation for this witness to be able to make that statement.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Sure.
Now, he actually said that the house didn't look abandoned. Now, under Rule 701, witnesses are allowed to testify in the form of an opinion if that's rationally based on their perception. Now, it's certainly a rationally based perception that if a house has not a single speck of dust anywhere, it's probably not abandoned.
I think any average Joe can walk into a house and be able to assess whether or not it's been lived in recently. So I'm going to allow the testimony.
So, sir, did you find any dust in that house?
None.
Was the house empty? Were there any belongings in it?
Yeah, there was some belongings. There was some clothes hanging up in the closet.
Mr. Kwong, I want to be very clear for the members of the jury, when you went to that house, were any appliances on?
Yeah, there was this big fan in the living room that was spinning. It was on.
Thank you. Your Honor, I have nothing further.
Does the government wish to cross-examine?
Yes, Your Honor.
Please proceed.
Mr. Kwong, I want to make something very clear. It's true that the defendant has been very generous to you.
Oh, definitely. Absolutely.
You've been working with the defendant for 5 years on your documentary.
That's right. Releases next fall.
And for that documentary, you've been offered $10 million.
Well, not me personally. I don't own all the footage. I just take it. But Ms. Bassett was offered $10 million by Hulu.
Well, the defendant said that you would get 20% of whatever she earned from the documentary.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I get my cut.
So you stand to make $2 million from the production of this documentary. Isn't that true?
That's true. Hulu comes through.
I want to talk about the observations that you had of the defendant and her husband. You first met the defendant back in 2015.
That's true.
And over the years, you were able to get a firsthand look into their relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. I spent a ton of time with them in those 3 years, basically 24/7.
So you know that the defendant and her husband didn't always get along.
Oh, of course not. Yeah, no, there were marital spats between the two. Absolutely.
And some of these spats were about the way that the elephant park was being run.
Yeah, they talked about that sometimes.
They would frequently disagree about how the elephant park was being run.
Sure. Yeah, I definitely heard some disagreements.
You know, Mr. Clark promised the defendant he would turn the park into a sanctuary.
That's right.
But to your knowledge, he never did anything to make that happen.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not really sure what the difference is between a park and a sanctuary, but I don't really think it happened.
Well, for years while you were at the park, the elephants were trapped in cages.
That's true. They were kept in pretty small cages.
Guests of the park were able to get really close up to the elephants.
Yeah, that's true. It was sort of like a petting zoo kind of thing.
It made the defendant angry that the elephants were being treated like they were in a petting zoo.
I think so.
I'm pulling up Exhibit 38 on the screen.
Objection, Your Honor. Facts not in evidence. May be heard.
Yes, Mr. Becker, go ahead.
Now, before trial, it was ruled that exhibits 4 through 33 were already in evidence. This exhibit has not been entered.
My second chair started a little too quickly. I'm fine with authenticating this evidence and then entering it.
Okay, then we'll instruct the jury to disregard anything they've seen of this video clip. Ms. Rich, please go through the motions and admit this document into evidence first.
Yes, Your Honor. And Mr. Kwong, what was just on the screen was a clip for your documentary that was filmed in June of 2017.
That's true.
It's a fair and accurate representation of that video clip.
The picture looks right to me.
And it hasn't been changed or altered in any way since you last saw it.
Nope.
The government offers what's been marked as Exhibit 38 into evidence.
No objections, Your Honor.
Okay, then it is admitted.
Think I'm sweet and nice. Go on. Keep underestimating me. I will lobby senators. I will protest big businesses. I will get in your face. I will take people to their grave if I have to. I will do anything to protect these elephants.
Mr. Kwong, after this was filmed, you saw that the defendant and the fights that she was having with her husband, they started to escalate.
Yeah, they got worse.
You watched as the defendant once threw a vase at Mr. Clark.
Yep, yeah, I saw that.
To improper character evidence under Rule 404, may I be heard?
Yes, Mr. Becker, go ahead.
Specifically, I'm objecting under 404B1. They're using evidence of a past action to allege that she acted in conformity with the trait demonstrated by that action. Now, they have alleged throughout today's trial that she killed her husband. They're using a past act of violence to establish a trait of violence.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Please.
The throwing of a vase is not a character trait, and this is actually an exception to character evidence because it goes to the defendant's motive for why she would want to kill her husband. And that's under Rule, that's under Rule 404B2.
May I respond?
1 second, Mr. Becker, I'll give you an opportunity. The testimony was that the defendant threw a vase. Did I understand that correctly?
That was the testimony.
Ms. Rich, how does the throwing of a vase go to motive?
Because it gives the actions of the defendant getting angry with her husband in the past and how she's having pent up anger with her husband that results in her throwing a vase at him because he is not complying with the way she wants the park run. That goes to her motive for why she would want him to disappear. And we've laid foundation for how things would change for the defendant once her husband did disappear.
Mr. Becker?
Yes, Your Honor. The fact that she threw a vase at him doesn't actually go toward any motive. It's not establishing anything she would gain from killing him. It's not establishing any plan she had to kill him. All it does is show a character trait for violence. That's why we believe they're using this, Your Honor, and if they're truly not, it's what the jury is going to take it for.
I'm going to allow the testimony. Overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
My apologies. My microphone was muted. Mr. Kwong, after that video was filmed, you saw the defendant throw a vase at her husband, correct?
That's right.
And just a month after that fight happened, Mr. Clark disappeared.
Yep, that's right. August was the last time I saw him.
Well, let's talk about what the defendant did after that disappearance. I want to show you a video that was filmed 6 months after the defendant's husband disappeared.
Okay.
You recognize this video filmed in your documentary 6 months after the defendant disappeared.
Elephant Queen, yes, ma'am.
It appears to be a fair and accurate representation of that,
That's right.
and it hasn't been changed or altered.
No.
The government offers what's been marked as Exhibit 44 into evidence.
Any objection? Defense, did we lose somebody?
Your microphone's muted.
Mr. Becker, we can't hear you.
My apologies, Your Honor. I'm very sorry for that. What I'm saying is we didn't know this was Exhibit 44 until she entered it into evidence because we weren't shown it. So if I could just have a moment of the court's indulgence to see if we have an objection to it.
Well, have you seen Exhibit 44 before, Mr. Becker?
Yes, Your Honor. I'm just identifying Exhibit 44, and I see now that we have no objection to it.
Okay, then it is admitted.
It's Christmas Eve. Don's not here, and I miss him very much. I feel his absence every single day. And it's difficult to find the strength to go on.
Mr. Kwong, after Mr. Clark disappeared, the defendant got what she had been asking for.
Sorry?
Well, in October of 2017, the defendant was able to turn what was her husband's animal park into a baby elephant sanctuary.
Oh, yeah. She got rid of the cages. The animals were able to roam free. It was honestly a better place for me to work.
It was only after Mr. Clark had disappeared that the defendant had total control of the sanctuary.
I figure.
That's a yes to my question. It was only after Mr. Clark disappeared that the defendant had total control of the sanctuary.
Yeah, they always kick me out when I try to look at the accounting papers, but I think that's how it went down.
I have nothing further for this witness.
Anything further?
No redirect, Your Honor. We just ask that Mr. Kwong be excused.
All right, thank you, Mr. Kwong. Does the defense have anything else? Or does the defense rest its case in chief?
We rest our case in chief, Your Honor. We're ready to move on to closing arguments whenever the other side is.
Okay. Let me just provide some instructions to our participants here and our viewers. Okay, we're about to hear closing arguments from both parties. Everyone should please switch back to speaker view. And since both witnesses have completed their testimony, judges can complete the witness portion of their ballots. So we'll give about a minute here for that to happen. Both parties ready to proceed with closing argument?
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, government?
The defendant was willing to kill for what she wanted. Today you've heard about the defendant's picture for her perfect life. In the defendant's perfect life, she's fully in control. She never has to worry about money ever again. And she finally owns her own animal sanctuary. A sanctuary that she can run exactly how she wants. After years of waiting, This perfect life is finally starting to come together. But it doesn't belong to her. Instead, it belongs to her husband. As long as her husband controlled the money, he controlled all the decisions. And eventually, that becomes too much for the defendant to handle. There was only one thing standing in the way of the defendant and her perfect life. And the defendant was willing to kill for what she wanted. So she made a plan. First, she made sure that if her husband disappeared or died, that she would get full control over all of his assets. And after she took care of that, it only took one syringe to end her husband's life. And that's why the government has charged the defendant with murder. When we brought that charge against the defendant, we brought along a burden of proof. We had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that it was the defendant who murdered her husband. To reach a decision in this case, it's important for you to consider what it's actually like to have reasonable doubt. Reasonable doubt isn't based on hypotheticals or assumptions. It's based on evidence. The evidence in this case shows that Mr. Clark was murdered because the defendant was willing to kill for what she wanted. So why did the defendant murder her husband? Well, you heard that back in 2011 when she first got married to Don Clark, the defendant's husband had promised her that he would be able to give her what she always wanted, the perfect life, the chance to run her own animal sanctuary. And at first, it seemed like he was living up to that promise when he built an elephant park for them to run together. But 1 year goes by, 2 years go by, 4 years go by, 6 years go by, and the defendant realized that she wasn't in control of this park at all. And it didn't look like she ever would be. Things at the park had taken a turn in the opposite direction of what the defendant wanted. And when she confronted her husband, he told her, as long as it's my money, we're going to run the park the way I want to. The defense's own witness testified today that the defendant and her husband were getting into fights over the way this park was run. Fights that turned physical. The defendant wanted control of that park, and she was desperate to get it, no matter the cost. You heard her say herself, I will get in your face. I will take people to their grave if I have to. I would do anything to protect these elephants. Take the defendant at her word, members of the jury. She was willing to kill for what she wanted. You heard today of the reason that the defendant couldn't run the park by herself. The reason she couldn't run it while her husband was still in the picture. She couldn't call the shots because she was completely financially dependent on Mr. Clark. But you also learned today that if the defendant's husband were to suddenly disappear or die, that she would get every single one of his assets, valued at $8 million. The defendant wanted a change. She wanted control. She wanted to take it from her husband, and she was willing to kill for what she wanted. And now that we know why the defendant would murder her husband, let's talk about what the evidence shows about how she did it. Agent Johnson told you about the syringes of elephant tranquilizer that the defendant had access to. And you heard that when the FBI searched the elephant park, there was one syringe missing. Now, the defense wants you to think that's just a coincidence, but members of the jury, we have to talk about what is reasonable here and what's based on the evidence. The evidence shows that one syringe of lethal tranquilizer was missing and unaccounted for just days after the defendant's husband mysteriously disappeared. A syringe that the defendant had access to. It's not a coincidence. Agent Johnson told you about what happened after the defendant took that syringe and murdered her husband. You heard that a van was transported all the way to a swamp. Now, what's reasonable here is that the defendant's body was dropped in that swamp and eaten by the alligators. You see, the defendant relied on the alligators in that swamp to get rid of the evidence for her. You don't need a body to prove a conviction when you have a reasonable explanation, when you have the totality of the evidence that shows the defendant had the motive, the means, and the opportunity to commit this crime. Members of the jury, if we're looking at what's reasonable in this case, there's only one explanation for what happened to Mr. Clark. Mr. Clark was murdered because the defendant decided that what she wanted was more important than her husband's life. The evidence has shown that on August 18th, 2017, the defendant was willing to kill for what she wanted. And that's why I'm asking you to find the defendant guilty. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Rich. Mr. Becker, do you have a closing argument?
Yes, Your Honor.
Please proceed.
Your Honor, as Rich, members of the jury, may it please the court. Guesses just aren't good enough. On August 18th, 2017, Kara Bassett went to sleep, and she's been living a nightmare ever since. She lost her husband, members of the jury, no note, no closure, nothing. But as if that weren't enough, the government somehow got it in their head that Miss Rich murdered her own husband in cold blood, that she slaughtered him with a syringe, drove to a swamp, and dumped his body away. Members of the jury, every single time, from her opening to her closing, that Miss Rich has told you that she knows what happened on that night. She has been guessing. At best, maybe you could call it an educated guess. At worst, it's a presumption of guilt, but either way, members of the jury, it doesn't matter. Because in a case like this, guesses just aren't good enough. It's actually why we have trials like this. It's why we're here today, and the way that we ensure that guesses won't be good enough is through something called the presumption of innocence. And that means that no matter how much information the government throws at you, and make no mistake, they did throw a lot. It's their job not just to bring you evidence, not just to bring you what they think of as a motive, but to bring you proof. To show you something solid along every link of the logical chain that ends in guilt. And if even one link in that chain is broken or missing, if there's even one point in their case where they're asking you to make an assumption, a leap of faith, a guess, the law is clear that in a case like this, the only presumption we can make is innocence. And that's why guesses just aren't good enough. But today the state is asking you for nothing if not a leap of faith, because there are three very fundamental problems with that chain of evidence that Ms. Rich tried to show you today. Let's take those one at a time. First, they're guessing about the body. Actually, members of the jury, they're guessing that there even was a crime. I want to make something very clear. It's something that we all actually already know, but something that I think deserves a little more attention. The government is bringing a murder charge without a murder victim. They're bringing a murder charge that seems to be based almost entirely on what they see as this motive. The fact that Ms. Bassett had disagreements with her husband. From her opening to her direct examination, to her cross-examination, to her closing. Ms. Rich talked over and over again about how she was willing to kill for what she wanted, but members of the jury, what evidence did we hear of that? Sure, they presented what she wanted. We know exactly what she wanted. We know she wanted that sanctuary to be a sanctuary. It's been made very clear to us, but where's the evidence of a plan? Where's the evidence of a motive? Where's the evidence of any prior bad acts, any kind of prior criminal history, any reason at all to believe that Miss Bassett wanted her husband dead? Because members of the jury, people don't just murder their husbands over business disagreements. That doesn't happen. Second, they're guessing about the swamp. You see, the prosecution's explanation for why that body wasn't found is because they say it was in the swamp. Mr. Rich told you it was eaten by alligators. But members of the jury, there is not a single shred of evidence to actually tie Ms. Bassett to that swamp at all. The lone piece of evidence that they relied upon, the lone piece of evidence that Ms. Rich relied upon to tie Ms. Bassett to that swamp were GPS records. GPS records which show that someone drove that car to the swamp on the night that Mr. Clark disappeared. But folks, we showed you our own GPS records. You saw on the cross-examination of Detective Johnson that the GPS, not on the car that could be driven by anyone, but on the phone that belonged specifically to Ms. Bassett, doesn't show her anywhere near the swamp on the night her husband disappeared. It wasn't Ms. Bassett in that car, members of the jury. It was her husband. Let's talk about that third guess. They're guessing about why Dawn Clark disappeared. And this is the one that really gets me. Because the prosecution has not even tried to explain that 52-minute phone call on the exact same night that Dawn Clark disappeared. They haven't even tried to explain the fact that he was talking to an unlisted Costa Rican number. They haven't even tried to explain the fact that he has off-the-books cash that mysteriously is missing, that no one has found. They haven't explained any of it. And most of all, members of the jury, what they can't explain is why the fan in his house in Costa Rica was on a year after they say he was dead. That is not even reasonable, and it's certainly not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The fact, it doesn't matter how many of these shaky, nebulous pieces of evidence they want to throw at. Because unless they can actually show you Mr. Clark's body to prove that he died, unless they can actually show you something, anything, to tie Ms. Bassett to that swamp, unless they can show you something to explain that 52-minute phone call or that fan being on, then Ms. Bassett is and will continue to be as innocent as she entered this courtroom. Because guesses aren't good enough to make up for those missing links in their chain of evidence. Guesses aren't good enough to overcome the presumption of innocence. Guesses aren't good enough to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. No, members of the jury, guesses just aren't good enough at all. They haven't met their burden. The state brought you guesses, but members of the jury, you deserve answers. Kara Bassett deserves answers. Find Kara Bassett not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Any rebuttal from the government?
Yes, Your Honor.
Please.
A story that isn't reasonable does not provide reasonable doubt. And members of the jury, this Costa Rica story that Mr. Becker wants you to believe just isn't consistent with the evidence at all. I mean, let's think about this logically. The defense's own witness just testified that the defendant had a private plane that he used to fly to Costa Rica all the time. And the evidence that we heard today is that that plane never left the airport on the night that Mr. Clark disappeared. How is Mr. Clark going to get to Costa Rica without his plane? The truth is, this Costa Rica story is exactly what the defendant wants you to believe. But it doesn't explain why the defendant's van drove to a swamp 139 miles away. Now, the defense says that her phone GPS placed her at home that night, but members of the jury, isn't it reasonable that she just left her phone at home? Mr. Becker said guesses aren't good enough, and members of the jury, we agree. That's why we're not guessing. The evidence in this case leaves no room for guesses. The only reasonable explanation about what happened to Mr. Clark that the evidence here supports is that the defendant was willing to kill for what she wanted. And that's exactly what she did. Find her guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rich. Okay. At this point, judges, please complete your ballots. Double check them and then go ahead and click the submit button. And everyone, please stay on the line here until all ballots have been submitted. And then we're going to do some very brief feedback for our competitors. Go ahead and give us a couple minutes here for people to complete their ballots.